I received the puck, I looked up, and I got hit.
I was going up for the rebound, and another one of my teammates was coming down from jumping and elbowed me in the head.
A concussion is a metabolic event in the brain, and it changes your cognitive processing.
I have one concussion on file. Do I believe I probably had more? Yeah.
I couldn't see straight, and I fell over. She kicked the ball, and I immediately knew to turn around. If it hit me in the face, it probably would have broken my nose. But I turned around and it hit me like right on the pony.
This is a much more serious issue than we thought it was just a few years ago. We've witnessed a rapid increase in the participation of girls and women in exercise and sport. There's very little real solid information on the impact of concussions and female athletes.
A concussion is a brain injury.
Concussions and Female Athletes is a co-production of the University of Minnesota, the Tucker Center for Research on Girls and Women in Sport, on the web at tuckercenter.org, and TPT's Minnesota channel.
Even though Title IX wasn't specifically about sports originally, it was just about a broader, you can't discriminate on the basis of gender, it has had its greatest impact in the world of sports. Before Title IX, there were about 1 in 27 girls played sports at the high school level. Today it's 1 in 3. For the first time in our history, we have a critical mass of young girls and women who play sports at all levels, from recreational to elite. Nationwide, about 40% of all people who participate in sports and physical activity, including the number of young women involved in scholarships at the intercollegiate level, are female.
Even though female athletes sustain fewer concussions in terms of frequency, the rate of concussion, which is a way of looking at injury per unit of activity time, the rates of concussion for female athletes, both in high school and college, are higher, 2 times or more higher than males in comparable sports. So when we look at basketball athletes, it's the female injury rate for concussions is significantly higher than males. Same with soccer, same with ice hockey, and so that's raised a lot of red flags in terms of researchers and practitioners trying to understand what it is about females that makes them more susceptible to concussion injury in those sports in particular.
Some of the research that's been done has just sort of extended what was being done on males, or just added a small sample of females to the research. But it does show that females seem to be having more concussions than males, and we're not sure why.
One of the theories is that women and girls are more apt to report their symptoms, and in some of the male sports there's a sort of a culture against talking about some of that.
Historically, I think people have thought that males are less likely to report than females, and I think the evidence bears that out. Unfortunately, I feel like the trend is going the other way, with girls now having to prove themselves in the male territory of sport historically, that have perhaps swayed too much the other way to trying to be tough in the same way that the guys are and not reporting.
When we see male athletes at the most elite levels who are enormously gifted, talented, dedicated, hardworking individuals, so the NFL, the NBA, Major League Baseball, they set the standard, as they should, both in terms of the gold standard for excellence in athletic achievement, and, whether they like it or not, as role models that we look up to and hear an awful lot about in the media, and they become a daily part of our lives.
They see the NHL players and, you know, wear their jerseys and have posters in their bedroom and that kind of thing, so they look up to these guys. And when you have the fighting penalties and the instigator penalties and all of that kind of thing, I think sometimes kids think that that's the way hockey is, and it's rough and tough, and you can fight out disagreements on the ice, and it's not a big deal, but it is a big deal.
And they set a standard that says, if you get hurt, if you have a concussion, your obligation is to get back in and help the team. You don't want to ever be known as somebody who can't cut it, and that tends to set the standard and the fear, frankly, for both males who are playing at less elite levels and for all females who say, if I have a concussion, I have to downgrade its importance, and the most important thing is that I get back in there and help my team, because otherwise I'll become an afterthought, or somebody else will come in and take my spot and I'll never get back on the field.
There are many circumstances in which I think we can all understand why an athlete might do anything possible to stay in the game. There's such a limited window of opportunity for athletes too, that they feel like every game matters, and so it's very important. So I think sometimes based on the situation, athletes will stay in. Something like 50% of athletes that had concussions weren't aware that the symptoms that they were having were symptoms of a concussion. So there's sort of a lack of knowledge or awareness. And I think there's a lot of peer pressure to play. Again, what we call in psychology impression management, managing how others see us, is very, very important in athletics. And in this case, it works to the disadvantage of the health of the athlete to be overly concerned about other people viewing you as weak or not tough enough if you admit to a concussion or seek help or treatment for a concussion.
We believe that right from the little children up through the professionals, that more than 50% of concussions are unreported, period. But then of those reported, the females are more likely to come forward. And they report not only, as I say, more often, but more symptoms than the males.
Another problem with concussions is sometimes it's hard to describe how you feel. It's very challenging for athletes, and so some people think that women are better at expressing that.
One of the things that we need to pay attention to in terms of gender differences in healing is that estrogen may actually have a protective effect on the healing of brain injuries.
Well, there could definitely be a difference in brain chemistry.
We know that physiologically, because of things such as even hormones, we know that the nervous systems of males and females respond differently to injury. We also know that depending on where somebody is in their lifespan, that people respond differently to an injury. So when there are circulating female hormones, we know that there's actually a protective effect when there are ischemic strokes. And so the incidence of ischemic stroke is greater in men than in premenopausal women. Once women get to menopause, there doesn't appear to be a protective effect. And so the rate of ischemic stroke appears comparable to males. Women have different kinds of cognitive or thinking skill difficulties after a concussion. And there are more difficulties related to the speed at which they process information, their language skills, their verbal memory. And also that changes through the lifespan with the removal of female hormones.
Obviously, football, the number of hits a player takes is uncomparable to probably any other sport, maybe with the exception of hockey. But every single play in football, you're getting impact, which is in hockey, it might be every so often. And in women's hockey, where it's non-checking, even though there's a lot of contact, I think the argument is that you receive far fewer impacts, but I would say that what we know from the research is that it doesn't have to be a heavy impact to cause brain injury or a concussion. So even something that might look inconsequential in terms of impact may indeed lead to a concussion. And I think that's why a lot of times it goes unreported.
What we don't understand is if what we consider subconcussive blows have any type of a long-term effect. That is really what we don't know now. So, everything's measured in newtons. We, have based some research, and we think that 96 newtons is about the average that the brain needs to receive in force for a concussion. Doesn't necessarily mean that's the force that's the helmet. What does a 20 newton force do if you get 200 of those in a day? We don't know. We don't know if there's enough trauma there to cause any imbalance in the brain.
Professionals get back usually faster, and then I think it's an average of around 2 weeks out for college level athletes, about a week more than that for high school. And then when you go down to the younger kids, they take longer too. And I think the females' length of time out is corresponding to the children. And we don't know really why that is. I have a couple of theories that haven't been tested or researched yet. It could be that when they are hit or in a collision, that neck is spinning, and we know it stretches the axons on the neurons in the brain, and there may be more stretching for those young females. There's an NIH study that shows a little less myelin on the axons in the females, and I wonder when you take the myelin off the axon, or it isn't there, then does that axon tangle more when there is a rotational spin or sudden linear acceleration or deceleration? A hockey player or a football player who's getting repeated trauma And when we measure that with the HITS telemetry, the accelerometers, a large hit of maybe 171 G-force may not cause any symptoms at all, and then maybe another 150 G-force, no symptoms. 30 G-force, and all of a sudden the player's had it, he's out. The symptoms have all manifested. It's as if you have a threshold and you can take a hit and then another hit, and then it can be a very small hit that just sort of pushes you right over the edge.
When we see concussions on the sideline or head injuries, one of the biggest things we're concerned about immediately is that there's something more going on, like a bleed in the brain, for example. And that's one of the things we're trying to assess for immediately on the sideline and trying to rule out or monitor for. We usually have those athletes come out as soon as they're identified, do a good neurological evaluation, including some thinking tests, some balance tests, and then we monitor them on the sidelines, give them some guidelines for when they go home.
There's two different mechanisms. There's what's called a coup or a direct, and a counter coup or indirect. So our brain's fluid. You got to think of it as like jello in your skull. And so when you get hit, you can have that directly, or you can have that as the brain kind of sloshes across and hits the other side of the brain, which is the counter coup. And we also know that there's more of a rotational component. We're more prone to having a concussion and prolonged symptoms with a rotational force versus a true linear acceleration.
One of the things that I learned at the Mayo Ice Hockey Summit on concussion that really stood out to me was one of the brain researchers explained a concussion as the brain is bathed in a chemical soup. And that really was poignant to me, because even when the body is free of physical symptomology, the cognitive recovery that we can't see, I think that chemical soup analogy is really powerful.
In the metabolic cascade, one of the big things that happens in the brain is that calcium ties up where another energy, the phosphorus, should have been binding. So this fatigue is very real that they feel. And they keep trying to fight it because they don't want to feel like that, and they know they're young and they shouldn't feel like that, but they do.
And you don't have to have a frank loss of consciousness either. And it causes an alteration in the brain and in different skills that are associated with your brain, like thinking, emotions, balance, hearing, sensitivity to light, sound.
Very worrisome, and it gets neglected, is the symptom of some neck pain. And they worry that when that's reported, or any obvious loss of consciousness, there's a feeling sometimes that those symptoms are associated with a more severe injury, severe concussion. It isn't always true.
Sometimes just a feeling of not being quite right, or I had an athlete say to me the other day, she felt like her brain was empty, which is a little concerning.
Dizziness, nausea, vomiting.
A player who is used to doing everything exactly right, performing perfectly, will forget the pass pattern in football or in hockey, might turn around and head toward the wrong goal.
They feel unsteady, sometimes they're irritable, have mood changes. We see a variety of things going on with sleeping patterns. Sometimes they are very fatigued, and sometimes they just don't sleep well.
Sometimes our physicians or our athletic trainers who are on the sidelines trying to observe behavior also have to tease apart. You know, has anybody been drinking a few too many Red Bull? Do you know what I mean? Or is it really that they, you know, took a big hit?
And related to thinking skills, difficulties with attention, concentration, the speed of processing information, and also difficulties with short-term memory.
So school can be very challenging.
But I'm also worried about the depression. There's many investigators where we've looked at the impact of severe injury on young athletes, and the depression is really very marked, particularly the more serious the injury, the higher the depression. In the first couple of weeks, usually, like somebody tears their ACL, and if you think about it, they're pulled out of their peer group, they're pulled out of they have exercise deprivation. There are some tests and measures we can use to try to tease those things apart.
The data I've seen says something like 10% of athletes that sustain a concussion roughly might have long-term symptoms, so post-concussive types of symptoms.
Between men and women, it's looking like women may have longer symptoms.
Research has shown us that once you've had one concussion, you're at 4 to 6 times greater risk of having a second concussion. And the whole idea is that we want to make sure that the concussions do not occur close together, because there is something called second impact syndrome, which occurs primarily in adolescence. We see it more in males than we do in females, which may be related to hormone effects. But what happens is there is this malignant brain swelling. The brain swells, and there are very, very serious side effects. Children die with this, and the ones that do not die are left with symptoms that are very significant, either cognitively, physically, and or emotionally for the rest of their lives, potentially.
If you take a sport like hockey, the size, the speed, the equipment, the aggressiveness has increased hugely. And then you add to that the fact that a lot of women don't have developed neck muscles, and there are some studies now that are showing the role that the neck muscles play, particularly in the anticipation piece. And if I were asking all of you in the room right now to tighten the muscles across your neck, and you were to tighten them really hard, and then you imagine somebody coming and hitting you, your head wouldn't spin very much, would it? Because you're guarding and activating those coacting muscles. But if your neck is really relaxed and you're not anticipating, and now somebody comes and hits, your head is going to spin in a rotational manner or forward to back. And so we really believe the role of anticipation is huge in protection. And I think the females haven't had as much emphasis perhaps on the neck strengthening. I'm not talking about at the elite levels, you know, with the women's Olympic teams, for example. Those athletes are probably just as toned as their male counterparts. But a lot of young girls in high school are starting those sports for the first few years. Their skills aren't still such that they're sure of themselves. So many of them are in hockey looking down at the puck, perhaps, and not seeing a collision coming, or not seeing, even though there's not a deliberate check on them, an impending collision can be just as damaging if it's not anticipated.
When somebody has a concussion, there really isn't anything that we can do about it once it occurs. We need to rest, we need to educate at that point, but anything that we could do in terms of a preemptive strike to try and educate people about signs and symptoms, not to go back in, not to lie about symptoms, to be able to recognize it in a team member when the team member is confused. These are really important things that we can do at the outset so that we can change rules, we can make state laws, we can look at equipment, we can make changes in the game field.
We have gone in one generation from young girls hoping that there is a team to young girls hoping that they make the team. That's the difference because of Title IX.
I started playing hockey when I was 5 years old. Hockey was kind of in my family. My dad coached, my brother played, and I just kind of initially was a little rink rat running around the rinks and kind of bugged my parents, when do I get to play, when do I get to play? And at 5 years old, they finally let me lace them up, and the only problem with that was there were no other girls playing at the time, so obviously my mom was a little bit cautious and worried that her youngest daughter would be playing with boys. But for me, it was just, I had a passion, I had a love for the game. It's what I woke up wanting to do, and when I went to bed at night, it was the last thing on my mind.
Steal by Stevens, brought down by Boone, scramble, score! Darwin!
My dad, actually, I grew up around the hockey rink. He was playing still at that time, and so I'd follow him there and just kind of hang around while he was on the ice, and I was just always around it. I started playing forward, and my mom actually tried to put me in figure skates, and I really wasn't having much of that after a few years, and I just really wanted to play hockey, and my mom was pretty against it. My dad, you know, was actually pretty excited about it, and then, you know, after 3 or 4 years, I gave up the figure skates, and just hockey was what I loved to do. There was a tournament where our goalie couldn't attend, and so we only had one goalie, and if we didn't have a goalie, we couldn't go to the tournament, and so I volunteered, and after that, I just wanted to continue playing because I had so much fun back there. I happened to be one of those women's hockey players that you didn't have a choice growing up. You had to play boys hockey or you weren't playing hockey. And my experience was very good in it. And I don't think, you know, I mean, when you get to high school, yes, the guys are a lot stronger, you know, a lot of different things can happen. But when you're in that, you know, until 13, 14-year-old age, there's no difference. And it's just you know, girls and boys playing.
I started as a figure skater, and then I eventually picked up hockey due to my older brother. I saw the equipment, the big pads, and I wanted to be like him. I started playing competitive hockey when I was a squirt. I played squirt travel, and then Pee-wees I played travel hockey, and Phantoms and midgets. I played all the way up until midgets boys hockey. I love playing boys hockey and being rough and checking. I love that. And I also love how girls hockey wasn't checking. It was a more finesse game, and I really, really enjoyed that. But I got to play both, so I was okay. And then I was a little rougher in the girls' games because of my experience with boys, you know, hitting and stuff like that.
I think a reason why I'm sitting here today as a 3-time Olympian is because I grew up playing with the boys. I always tell people that, I always say it, I'm for girls growing up to play co-ed. I think it's huge. I think there's an intensity, a competitiveness that boys bring out in you that girls I don't want to say naturally have. I think it needs to be brought out. And I think boys just kind of have that competitive instinct, and I think you learn from them and they also learn from you. I think we're a heck of a lot better listeners and understand things. The vision of the game more, I think we understand, but boys have the ability to just go harder and be invincible and just have a competitive era about them, that they want the puck and they want the score. And
Natalie Darwin's show, welcome to it right now, guys.
Did I have to compete harder because I was playing against the boys and the only girl out there? For sure. Yeah, for sure.
I began playing officially probably in 6th grade.
I started in BAA, which is Bloomington Athletic Association, probably in 3rd or 4th grade. And then I started playing traveling at U12, which is under 12 for Bloomington.
My folks signed us up for it, and I fell in love with it instantly.
I still play, so I guess I never stopped.
Since 4th grade, I started playing at a rec team in 4th grade, and then played for school and traveling teams, and now in high school. It was during practice, and I didn't actually hit my head on the ground, just the initial impact. I couldn't keep my eyes open. I was dizzy, and my eyes started flickering. They said that my eyes were like twitching and moving back and forth, and I couldn't really control it, couldn't keep them open, and couldn't look in the light. And then I tried to get up and walk back, and I almost fell over.
I got a call from my husband that he was on the way to the emergency room with Natalie. That was our first trip to the ER, and they said she needed to go 5 days without headaches, and then she could go back to, or she could start working out again. And we got her to about the end of January, and she went about 5 days without headaches, and then went back to practice and ran, and within about 15 minutes, she was symptomatic entirely again of all the things she had with the original concussion, and we had her back in the ER again. We knew right away what it was. The eyes it's very frightening to look at your child and know that they can't focus on you. It was really interesting because when the original one happened, the next morning I went in, and I'd gotten home late from being in Dallas, and I went into her bedroom and asked her if she remembered what happened. And she walked me through it. But later that day, she couldn't remember any of it. So it was like within 12 hours, she could remember it, and 24 hours later, it was gone.
We had 2 other girls had concussions, but those were pretty minor. They were out for 2 or 3 weeks, and then they were back. So that's what I thought was going to happen with me. It didn't really work out.
We had a goalkeeper last fall at Parr Lake High School who got a concussion. He was out for about 2 to 3 weeks, which was, I thought, a pretty realistic time. Now, my goalkeeper that I currently have, she's been out for 2.5 months. So apparently the time is very variable.
My first concussion was probably 4 years ago, playing in an adult league. I woke up underneath the ambulance. I didn't have a whole lot of the normal common type of experiences. I didn't have a headache. I could feel a strange sensation in my head when I went up and down stairs afterwards. I felt very almost euphoric for quite a while afterwards, just kind of different. But for the most part, I felt really good. I felt good enough to be playing again. But I have a brother-in-law who's a physician who insisted that I stay out. So that was probably really good that he's as firm as he is. If you don't have any noticeable type of things, you want to get in there and you want to play, because the only reason we all play is because of the love of the game. And so it was a hard balance because I had no noticeable injuries. I had nothing, no mark to say I am injured. And I think that kind of was part of part of it. I felt fine. I didn't look injured, so why not play?
On this team, we've had one person have 2 concussions within the last year. And of the girls that I know of from my other daughter's teams, the girls that have had 1 concussion have usually had more than 1.
I think it was junior year. It was during warm-ups, and I ran into, me and a teammate we had a head collision. We were both knocked out. We both opened our eyes and we were sitting in the lobby laying down on some benches. Headaches. We had to sit out a couple months for that. The last concussion was probably a little more than a month ago. Yeah, that was with the Minnesota Whitecaps. I feel like I've gotten way more concussions than girls. That 1 concussion for the boys' Bantam game was from guys' hockey. All my other concussions were from girls' hockey, and it's usually unexpected collisions or impacts.
A somewhat violent collision into the boards with another player. I'm not sure either of us were really at fault, but I think my head took the brunt of everything against the boards.
Obviously there's no checking in women's hockey, but anyone who tells you who's played the sport says that's not particularly true. And at the time I was only 18 years old and we were playing a game against Team Canada. I was on the US team and just kind of caught a pass up the middle, and a girl lined me up and got the best of me. And at that time I was very disoriented. I couldn't tell you how I felt at the exact moment because I don't remember. I just remember kind of scrambling back to my feet, and luckily the bench was only a couple feet away, and got back on the bench and just kind of felt out of it, kind of felt dazed. The trainer and the coach came by and said, "You all right?" And I said, "Yep." And the next shift when I went out, obviously I knew something was a little off. They probably saw something was a little off, me scrambling around on the ice. And so I came back, and the coach asked again, the trainer, "Are you okay?" And I said, "I don't feel right." And they said, "Yep, go hit the showers, you're done for the night."
When you break your wrist or you break your ankle, it's an injury. But when you have a concussion, you think that it's not really an injury, when you're going through it, because you think you should be able to go right back to playing because you're not really limited by much of anything physically. Some girl ran me and took me down, and then my helmet slipped up. And so my head hit the back of the ice, and I didn't really have any protection on that one. I didn't remember who people were, and I didn't remember things, and I went through that whole memory impair type thing, and some of the other ones that I didn't have that. So, I think there's obviously, I'm not a doctor per se, but I know that there's definitely different levels of concussions, and I think for that one, after that serious one, it was kind of, whoa, what just happened? I think I got depressed a little bit, anybody who is competitive really wants to always be in the game, and so when you're sitting out and watching and missing out on being a part of that, myself and I think my parents and everybody wondered whether this was really worth it. But I did clear up and I did come back to normal and I was fine, and so I don't really know. I'm still learning a lot about it myself as a coach, kind of being very sensitive to when my players get hit or something happens to them, because there is a lot going on, and studying and how does it affect you later on in life. And so I think some of that stuff that I start to think about now, but you don't think about that as a player because all you want to do is play. As you get older, you start to learn that the rest of your life is more important than the actual game itself.
I get headaches. That's why I have to stay hydrated. I'm really sensitive to loud noises. I get confused. I'm not too good with time. I'm not very aware of time. Short-term memory loss is probably the worst I'm experiencing right now.
I think one thing you need to watch for, and especially young people, when they're part of a team and things that are happening are very exciting and they for the first time can't be part of it, you really have to watch for them getting depressed, and that fine line between just being disappointed and really being very depressed about it. And she kept her spirits up. I think her coaches were amazing about it. They were incredibly supportive of her, and they desperately wanted her back. She's the tallest kid on the team. In fact, they were thrilled that she was cleared to be on the bench in uniform because at least she looked like a threat. And I think the thing we kept telling her is, she kind of has a chronic ankle thing, and we said, Natalie, with your ankle, you can go back when it's not fully healed and it just swells, and we just ice it, right? Well, with a concussion, it has to be fully healed.
Make that person concussed still feel a part of the team, because there's nothing like actually suiting up and playing in a game and helping your teammate in the actual sport you play. And so when they're not doing that and fulfilling that role, they kind of can feel a little bit lost. And so I would just encourage those teammates to at best be supportive of that person, have them continue to be a part of the team, feel a part of the team, feel needed.
We're really big in focusing, especially down in Prior Lake, on building community and building team, and always telling the girls to always have each other's back. And that is one way that we have seen the kids will let us know so-and-so's out on the field and she's really hurting. Or I can tell you of an instance where a goalie went down and was hit very hard. We were on the sideline and didn't see it, but one of the defenders picked up on her confusion and the fact that she just wasn't with it anymore. And so they sent word that she had to get off the field immediately.
When I played traveling soccer, concussions weren't really talked about when I was younger. A concussion typically meant that there was severe head trauma. In soccer, it would typically mean that someone either got kicked pretty hard in the head or ran into a goalpost. And thinking about my youth and what was in the medicine cabinet or in the bag that everybody has for the first aid kit, there were smelling salts, which I think is pretty interesting. So apparently if someone just got knocked out on the field, they would just run out with those salts and get them up and potentially go back in.
When I was at Wisconsin and that last concussion had happened, our athletic trainer worked specifically on my neck strength and, just being a little bit more aware of my surroundings, peripherally, just so I could be more cognizant of something happening like that, and balance and core stability and stuff like that. So you learn a lot more about, physically what you can control.
We're finding that all sorts of overall fitness really helps in protecting the body. If you know you're going to get hit, you can move quicker, you can react quicker, maybe your body can tense up to try to protect from getting hit a little bit harder.
Between the physical therapists and the occupational therapists, they recognize stuff that we didn't even in the ER hadn't seen. Things like balance, that Natalie's always been real athletic and being able to just stand on one foot, she couldn't do it. And we never told her, Natalie, try and stand on one foot, see how that goes. And the occupational therapist had her do that. And then we saw progress. The first visit, she couldn't do a lot. And by the 6th or 7th visit, she was so much better. The occupational therapist wanted her only going to school part-time, so they switched her schedule around at school. They gave her a pass at school whereby she could, anytime she felt any of the headaches or anything coming on, she could go to the nurse's office. We started dropping her off. We dropped her off early or later in the day to school, so we had to change our work schedules to make that work.
When we started the women's hockey program at St. Scholastica, our trainer, 2 years ago when I was, building a team or out recruiting to get a team, our trainer told our AD, well, we're not going to travel the women's hockey team with a trainer, on the road, and because there's no checking, why would you? So there's less chance for injury. And I was all up in arms and demanded that we were traveling with a trainer. I don't think people are aware that there's a lot more head injuries in women's hockey, and I've noticed that. I think a lot of it does have to do with they're not experienced in being prepared to take a hit, or they do tense up, and I think a lot of it is, when you're not prepared for that and you tense up or you see it coming, then all of a sudden something happens. And the women's game has actually gotten so much better in the last 10 years, so I think the skill level also has something to do with that. Women are playing aggressive. It's not just, they're out there passing a puck and taking a shot. They're playing aggressive.
You just got to know yourself and be disciplined enough to allow yourself to sit out. Even if you feel like you're ready to go and you just want to get out there and play, if your mind can't keep up, you're better off just recovering, resting, doing the things you need to do so you can come back 100%. Because I feel like a lot of the pressure is usually indirect pressure from teammates and coaches, constantly asking, when are you going to be ready to play? Are you feeling better? Are you going to be able to skate today? It's kind of indirect pressure because then you're like, well, I have to put the team first. You feel obligated. You know, I'm willing to sacrifice myself to do what I need to do for the team. But after I've had some time to really reflect on past experiences, I'm actually helping the team out more by making sure I'm fully recovered to return to play.
I think looking in a player's eyes kind of says it all. You know, if they look a little glazed over or something like that, or they're just kind of acting a little goofy, it's just signs to watch out for. Obviously, you know, the competitive hockey players are going to shrug that off and want to be able to play and compete every shift. So you just got to keep an eye on those kids who are a little more stubborn. Watching their action time, if they're a little off on their skates the next shift, it might be a little red flag to go up in your mind and then ask them, you know, the next shift when they get back to the bench. But for the most part, I think the players are pretty honest and know it's a pretty serious issue at hand right now.
From a traveling soccer coach perspective, we try to work really hard. I have a number of players who've gotten injured, and I ask the parents for permission for their trainer or their physician to be in contact with me and let me know exactly what their child can and can't do. And there have been times when parents have said they're ready to go, and I've had to say, no, they're not, based on literature that I've read or people that I've talked to, and that's a tough conversation.
We have some tests and some tools that can help you assess people's baseline, and then if they have a concussion, try to compare to those.
And the more tools that you have in your toolbox, the better house you can build. But it really still comes down to the carpenter, in our case the clinician, and the clinical exam being the gold standard. But these are great tools to kind of catch some of the cognitive impairment. And what it's really doing, there's 8 metrics that it looks at. Memory and working memory, both visual and verbal. It's going to look at attention span. It's going to look at reaction time. It's going to look at what we call visual motor speed, kind of how quickly you're functioning, because concussion can affect different areas of the brain. It's a functional injury where the brain's not getting the energy, the glucose it needs to function properly based on this neurometabolic cascade that happens. And so these tests are a little bit more sensitive to picking up some of the subtle cognitive impairments, especially later on in the injury as we're getting ready to return to activity.
Baseline testing provides a neuropsychological baseline of athlete performance in terms of things like reaction time and other cognitive processing tasks. And then if an athlete is concussed, they compare their scores on these same neurocognitive tests to their scores at baseline and note the difference, and then really don't allow the athletes to return to play until their neurocognitive capabilities have returned to that baseline level. So it really establishes a pre-injury sense for what that athlete's cognitive abilities are and provides a standard against which to judge their recovery.
There is some controversy in the sports medicine world about how good are these cognitive tests that we're doing and what do they really mean, and are we interpreting them correctly? And again, I think it's early on in the evolution of these things, and we have a lot to learn still.
I just had an experience with one of my goalkeepers who experienced a concussion while she was playing in a different league than I was coaching in an indoor, and she did not have a baseline. And what's proving to be a little bit difficult going through the process of her concussion is that without that initial baseline, it's difficult for the physician to say if she's cleared, if she's not cleared, because that baseline is missing. And at this age, you don't know if their sleeping pattern is due to the concussion or if their sleeping pattern is due to puberty, hormones, adolescence. And so we're finding a really difficult time getting a definitive answer if this child is ready to come back and play or if she should be held out.
It's a silent, hidden injury. There's no crutches, there's no sling, there's no bruising. So it's easy for the patient to come in and tell us, I feel great today and I can do everything and even get through some of our normal routine, but having some of the more sensitive tests and some of the understanding of what the patient's baseline scores are.
A lot of the symptoms of concussion, you can feel that from exerting yourself, or maybe you're a little dehydrated, or maybe you have a cold coming on, you're just not in your top form. People get headaches, for example, for lots of reasons. Headaches are a very common thing. So some of it's about the constellation of symptoms, and that's why we encourage the athletes to report these symptoms to the medical staff and let us try to help them evaluate it.
Usually you can tell by how hard they go down that there's probably going to be an issue. On the indoor turf, it seems to be harder. And the new turf is much softer than it used to be, but the other fields used to have cement directly underneath the turf, and now they put rubber pellets underneath with a sand base below that now, so it's much more forgiving than it used to be on the older turf fields. But oftentimes I'll go head-to-head in a soccer game, and that's where a lot of concussions come from.
When I think about what coaches should know, I think about three things: watch, learn, and listen. And so coaches, first of all, need to know their sport well enough and their athletes well enough, and to be watching for high-risk kinds of impact situations where the head was moved rapidly and forcefully in a whiplash sort of motion or through a direct hit. But also I've seen many times where concussions can result from very minor, what seem to be fairly minor contacts and incidents. And so I think a coach needs to be very knowledgeable and watch, first of all, for potential situations where an athlete might have been injured or sustained a concussion. Secondly, I guess really before that, the coach should educate themselves about what these signs and symptoms of concussion are. And so when I say learn, the coaches need to educate themselves. There are great online training tools through the CDC and the National Federation of High Schools. Both have free online training modules. And so I think it's really imperative for every coach to learn the symptoms that they may observe as a coach. In other words, an athlete who now you've witnessed this high-risk event, and then you see symptoms like an athlete being confused about their plays or assignments, falling to the ground and then getting back up again, just stumbling and just general sorts of confusion. And the third thing that a coach needs to do is listen. So watch, learn, and listen. Listen to their athletes when they report things like headaches, or that they're hearing noises in their head, or when they're dizzy and nauseous, and other kinds of signs and symptoms that the athlete sustains.
Everyone's been getting on the bandwagon about, gee, we've got to make sure everyone sees a qualified healthcare provider, a qualified physician. Well, up in Ely, Minnesota, is that an OBGYN just because it's a doctor? Do you know what I mean? Or what about a PT who's been very well educated in sports medicine, an athletic trainer? You know, they would probably be better in many cases than a physician. So I'm from a family of physicians too, so I'm not nailing anybody. I'm just saying everyone's got to have the database up and have their skills up. But I don't know that it matters too much what type of a physician it is, as long as they're skilled and competent and have recently reviewed all of this information.
I'm a certified athletic trainer. We get exposed to it a lot. We're on the sidelines. We see these injuries acutely, and you feel something just isn't right with this patient. And the nice thing in our setting is you're usually around these kids. If you're working in a high school or college setting, you're seeing these kids every day, you know their personalities, so that helps a lot. And as somebody's injured and you see them coming back, you can see kind of things start to return. But it's just asking a very detailed question. You don't ask, how do you feel? You know, you ask what they did the night before, what time they went to bed, when they normally went to bed, what they did the day before. Did you feel more fatigued after class? Did you get a headache throughout the day? Did you feel like you wanted to go home and take a nap? Do you feel more slowed down? You know, you get really in depth with some of the questions, and you really want them to feel like they are perfect. And then we look at their neurocognitive testing, and then we start to progress them in activity.
The one bad thing about youth hockey is oftentimes there's not a trainer available, so it comes down to the officials on the ice or the coaches who are, you know, typically just parents of a player. So usually the coaches will come out on the ice and, you know, help escort the player off the ice.
You're not a medical person out there. Guy gets knocked down, you look at him, you say, hey, hold it, stay here, let's get the trainer out here to look at you. And I think that today, more than ever, they're looking for concussions. You know, before they'd give you a couple aspirin, get back in the game.
For the most part, I think their job is to really uphold the laws of the game and protect the integrity and safety of all of our players. And with that, obviously, if they see anything, if they notice anything, and particularly a goalie, if a goalie gets hit in a play, the distance from a coach to a goalie is quite greater than one of the referees. So if they see something, by all means, you know, we all need to take care of all the players. But I don't think that the responsibility falls on their shoulders. Again, I think it's just something where everyone, if they see something that looks a mess, you know, try to get as many people involved as possible.
At the youth level, I think basically we're there for the safety of the players. Obviously we're making calls, you know, determining goals and offsides, icing, that kind of thing, but I think it generally really ultimately comes down to the safety and well-being of the players.
Well, over in Europe, any goaltender that gets a puck in the mask, it's an automatic whistle. Here it's not. But goaltender goes to one knee, I'm blowing the whistle. Go up to the goaltender, you know what, you okay? They look a little groggy. Let's get the trainer out here to take a look at them because we're not going to take any chances.
In what I would consider youth athletes under the age of 18, I think it's very beneficial to test within the first 24 hours. That can give you kind of a global score and an understanding where they're at. And that can help make a decision as to whether or not this patient needs to be removed from schoolwork, from any type of extracurricular activities they may have going on as far as meetings or 4-H or whatnot. But that really gives you a better understanding of how impaired they might be. The more impaired, the more inclined you would be to just give them absolute rest for a few days.
The responsibility for return to play is a little controversial, but I think it should not be the athlete, because the athlete is always going to want to play, to please the coach, to do it for the team, because they like to compete. So the athlete is out. The coach, I think if they're educated and in tune with the signs and symptoms, maybe, but the coach might also have other conditions about winning and competing and, you know, wanting to outperform others, that they might make poor decisions in the heat of the moment. And I think parents most often have their child's best interest at heart, but might also fall into that, well, if I take my child out, they won't be noticed, and he or she will be perceived as not a team player, and they might not get exposure for the college scholarship that all parents think their children will get. And so parents might not be the best either. So I really do think it has to be a medical professional that's trained in concussions and knowing when return to play is appropriate.
It's mandatory now that you take them out. People have gotten much more strict about what you do, and they're required to have clearance before returning to play. It's gone, you know, much further than when we were kids. You got a concussion, you got knocked unconscious, you were usually playing before the end of the game again. Well, now you can't return to high school sports or return to the club sports without being checked out and released.
So for a person who's sort of followed a standard concussion resolution, for example, most people with a concussion will get better in 7 to 10 days. Have not had a long history of concussion, for example, in the past, or concussions that took a long time to get better, or one that was very close to the current concussion, then we'll try to start them back with some light exertion usually put them on something like an exercise bike, and not so much to get a workout, but just to get their heart rate up a little bit and get moving and see how they feel. And then we generally do a graduated progression from there, trying to make it a little more intense, adding some impact. Then we add a little more stimulation, a little more agility, side-to-side movements. For example, if you're a hockey player, some time on the ice, maybe with a few other players doing some drills, but not maybe the full team, for example. And then eventually the last stage is putting people back into a full contact situation. So we really try to protect them from being in conditions where they can get hit again or re-injured. And anytime that they have symptoms develop, then we usually have them step back and repeat the level beforehand and make sure that they're okay before we advance them.
I think in that time that they've been off, 3 weeks or something, I really think they're losing strength in neck muscles and so on while they're supposedly resting. And I just give this to a comparison. I work a lot in sports medicine and see a lot of the ACL reconstructed young athletes. And if you put a measuring tape on their thigh after surgery, they lose about an inch, inch and a half, 2 inches of quad, of hamstring and quadriceps, in having been somewhat resting. Do you know what I mean? Just not pressing leg weights. And I wouldn't be surprised if we see some of those changes in the neck too. And so I think we're going to need some rehab in making sure those muscles are really toned, and it may decrease some of the second follow-up concussions.
Many athletes and parents and coaches in particular, I would say, think that, falsely assume that equipment will protect athletes from concussions, when in fact that's not what helmets are designed for.
It protects against focal injury from a puck or a stick or a skate blade if it were to catch the helmet, but it can't stop the rotational acceleration or the linear acceleration.
Technique is probably the biggest thing that can be done to prevent concussion. You know, when it comes to sports like hockey, keeping your heads up. Sports like basketball, being aware, basketball and soccer, being aware of your surroundings and trying to protect yourself from the elbow and teaching good fundamentals in those sports from the coach's aspect can help really reduce the number of these injuries.
I've done a little bit of work on how coach and parent behaviors on the sidelines influence athlete behavior on the field. One of the interesting studies that I have worked on is that when athletes perceive that coaches and parents want them to win and they want them to do anything to win, it's win at all costs, that athletes will be more likely to demonstrate poor sport behavior, which includes the intent to injure others. And so what we find is that when the coaches and parents are acting in ways that encourage poor sportsmanship, the athletes themselves will be more likely to injure others, which could then lead to concussion.
Parents scream and yell, and you see the kids kind of pick it up a little bit, just like coaches. Hit them, hit them, hit them. Hold it. It's a game of skating, not hitting. You know, when there's squirts or peewees, you know, that's when they can start hitting. Hit them, hit them. Kids are, you watch it, they're kind of running at players.
I haven't had to personally have any spectators leave the rink, but I have worked several games where we've had to have a coach leave the bench, and that's never fun. You know, it's not good for the kids, and it's not good for the team, and that kind of thing. And it kind of changes the dynamic of the game.
And that's what's good about women's ice hockey. They angle, they can't hit. There's a lot of body contact, but they angle. And I think that's what these kids should be taught, how to angle instead of trying to put somebody through the end boards.
Oftentimes when you're playing sports, especially when we're playing high school and older sports, I've noticed that there seems to be a lot of aggressiveness out on the field. And too often it's unfounded aggression and people are just playing haphazardly. I don't know if people really realize what damage they can do to other people while they're playing, if they're playing out of control or outside the laws of the game.
Typically after a whistle or something during a stoppage, you know, I might skate over to a player and just tell them that, hey, this is what I'm seeing and this is not acceptable. You know, it hasn't gotten out of control yet, but you know, it looks like it might have the potential to. And I've also gone and talked to coaches between periods and just told them, you know, this is what I'm seeing.
You want to talk all the time. Good officials, you know what, you'll see them always yipping with players like on face-offs. Keep your sticks down. I'm going to put the puck down, you put your stick up, I'm going to throw you out of here. Stuff like that. But mainly along the boards, when somebody's going to get really smacked, you say, hey, don't hit him from behind, his back's turned now. You know, things like that. So officials are talking to players all the time. Or if somebody got away with something, you missed it, you say, you know what, I missed that one, I'm not going to miss it next time. So don't put me in that situation again.
Learning good sportsmanship at a young age, I think, is something that that player holds on to, you know, those early lessons and carries forward with them when they get up into the high school level and beyond.
One of the problems in focusing solely on female athletes and concussion is around this idea of how concussions is taken up by the media. So when a female gets concussion, the first question that comes up, or the first comment, is that, well, female athletes are vulnerable and weak, and maybe we should rethink female athlete participation in sport in general. The counter to that is when males sustain concussions, the question never becomes, well, maybe he's too weak and vulnerable to play sport, so we should think about new policies or rules or sit him out altogether, and that males are weak and vulnerable. That never gets taken up by the media.
This is such an important topic for both genders. For females, not addressed very well yet, but for all kids, we need to have research. Then it's got to be multidisciplinary. We've got to have physicians working with kinesiologists, working with psychologists and sports psychologists, biomechanics people. We really will only get the answers when we really wrap our arms around this problem and let egos kind of fall out of the way.
There's no magic number that says, like, you've had 3 concussions, you should never do a contact sport again. We don't actually know those numbers, and a lot of it is very dependent on the person's concussion, what kind of symptoms they have, how long it takes to clear up, how close their concussions are together.
What we see with any long-term brain damage, you can get to the extreme where the person is unable to take care of themselves. The same thing you would see with a stroke or any other dementia. It can be very tragic, and of course it's horrible because these are young people And a lot of these kids are taking their hits as, repetitive hits at a very young age. And when that's accumulating, they may be in their 30s or 40s at a time when we may be seeing them manifesting these very severe symptoms.
Sometimes, unfortunately, changes don't occur until there is something scary or catastrophic. And so though many of us really want to use things like education, prevention to really help change behavior, unfortunately it's catastrophes that garner people's attention and also really make things happen at a quicker speed in terms of development of programs, making big changes in how we act and how we plan. We're really just at the start of looking at sex and gender differences. Some of the earliest work was done looking at moderate to severe brain injuries. And in many ways, it looks as though the literature that we're seeing right now, there's still a mixture of studies that say that there are more catastrophic outcomes. Once somebody starts having concussions, I think if they are children, I think that parents really need to not be a friend, but have the information that they need to be able to guide the level of participation and perhaps change the level of participation or the sport if somebody has sustained too many injuries. And that goes for other types of sports injuries that may not be concussions. The difference with a concussion is that we have concerns about the ability to think over the lifespan.
Concussions and Female Athletes is a co-production of the University of Minnesota, the Tucker Center for Research on Girls and Women in Sport, on the web at tuckercenter.org, and TPT's Minnesota channel.